Lecture 10, North Sentinel Island. First, the Bay of Bengal steals your intentions. You arrive, if only in imagination, since a permit will never be granted, near a jade-green smudge of land that refuses to be described. North Sentinel Island does not care for the labels you brought. The only greeting is the salt wind and a distant cry of a seabird that sounds suspiciously like, "Keep away." You drift off the reef at a respectful distance, apologizing under your breath for even coming this close. The water here smells of wet wood and something metallic, as if hinting at the iron blades hidden in the jungle. A few coconut palms fringe the white beach, but there are no docks, no welcome signs. The surf and the cicadas take turns announcing the hours to a forest that has never needed a clock. In the silence, North Sentinel reveals itself as a rumor made real, an island that prefers not to be known. It sits in the Bay of Bengal, 11.557 degrees north, 92.241 degrees east, about 60 kilometers west of Port Blair on South Andaman, yet it may as well be on another planet. A coral halo protects it, shallow turquoise inside, deep navy beyond. Past the line where the lagoon's pale water turns blue, Indian law takes over, an invisible boundary in these seas that firmly states, in bureaucratic prose, kindly stay away. North Sentinel is small, roughly 60 square kilometers of land rising from a volcanic base and girdled by reefs. The island's highest point is barely 100 m above the sea. From afar it looks like a green bowl floating on a bright lagoon. Its shape is nearly square, edged by beaches that the daily tides constantly redraw. The nearest inhabited land is South Andaman Island, 12.15 degrees north, 92.76 degrees east, where Port Blair, the capital of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, churns with about 150,000 residents and an ever-expanding file bureaucracy. But here on North Sentinel, there are no known settlements visible from the air beyond a few small thatched lean-tos camouflaged by the canopy. The dense rainforest, terminalia, screw pine, orchids clinging to towering dipterocarpus, drinks in monsoon rains and hides all paths from satellite eyes. At low tide the island grows, sandbars and reef flats emerge like extra rooms, and blacktip reef sharks patrol the shallows while locals stroll out to gather shellfish. This is a world self-contained. If the age of maps still had blank corners, one would be here. The people of North Sentinel Island, often called the Sentinelese, have been here for uncounted generations, thoroughly uninterested in advertising their presence. They are one of the most isolated communities on Earth. India classifies them as a particularly vulnerable tribal group, and a scheduled tribe, affording them protections under national law. As of the last official census in 2011, officials could only estimate their number at around 50. One patrol recorded 12 men and 3 women that year, a likely undercount. Others have speculated anywhere from a few dozen up to a few hundred individuals, but no precise census is possible, nor is it desirable. They are, by design, a mystery. What is certain is that their language is unrecorded and unclassified, their name for themselves unknown. They live by hunting, fishing, and gathering in their forests, as their ancestors did for millennia. They have no farms, no fields, and by all accounts no interest in ours. The Indian government, realizing the importance of their seclusion, has drawn a strict cordon around North Sentinel Island. Since 1956 the island has been a protected tribal reserve. It is illegal to approach closer than a prescribed distance, originally 3 nautical miles. 5.6 kilometers, under the 1950s regulation, later expanded to 5 nautical miles, 9 kilometer, in practice, and the surrounding waters are regularly patrolled by the Indian Coast Guard. No tourist may land, no fisherman may legally cast a net here. In February 2019, India's Ministry of Home Affairs reaffirmed that North Sentinel Island, along with a 5 km radius of sea, is a notified tribal reserve, with the Sentinelese entitled to complete isolation. The law promises up to 5 years in prison for intruders who violate this boundary. This is not just to protect the tribe's privacy, it is literally to protect their lives. With no immunity to common diseases, even a stray cold virus could be as lethal as a bullet. The buffer zone is a quarantine line as much as a border. To understand how North Sentinel became this final redoubt of uncontacted humanity, one must appreciate its geography and deep history. 10,000 years ago, during the end of the last ice age, sea levels were lower and the Andaman Islands were connected to larger landmasses. As the oceans rose around 8000 BCE, each hilltop of the Andaman chain became marooned as an island. The peoples living on those hills had to adapt in isolation. Across the archipelago, distinct tribes and cultures formed, the Great Andamanese in the north, once several thousand strong but later devastated by colonialism, the Onge and Jarawa in the South and Middle Islands, the Shompen in the Nicobar group, among others. Genetic evidence suggests these tribes descend from some of the earliest migrations out of Africa, possessing lineages tens of thousands of years old in Asia. The Sentinelese likely share ancient roots with the Onge and Jarawa, but their language and customs have evolved behind their coral moat. For perhaps 30,000 to 60,000 years humans have trodden the shores of North Sentinel, watching the stars wheel overhead with no notion of nations or outside history. 33 L 185-192. The world's empires rose and fell a hemisphere away. Here, time unspooled at its own pace. What developed was a complete, self-contained way of life tuned exquisitely to this small island. The Sentinelese learned every pathway in their forest, every seasonal rhythm of sea and sky. While we call them isolated, from their perspective they have everything they need. It is the rest of the world that is irrelevant. A view from offshore at dawn provides a few clues to their society. If you float quietly beyond the reef line, binoculars might reveal temporary lean-to huts near the beach edge, roofed with broad leaves and open on the windward side. These shelters are not permanent houses but seasonal camps, simple, low structures that can be quickly abandoned and rebuilt, perfectly suited for a mobile life. There are often canoes pulled up on the sand too, narrow dugouts with raised edges and a platform midsection. Uniquely, the Sentinelese propel these canoes with long poles, punting in the shallow lagoon rather than paddling into the open sea. That design hints at their daily economics. They fish and forage close to shore, always able to leap out and wade home if a squall blows up. Early in the morning, you might see dark figures moving in the intertidal zone, spearing fish in the tidal pools or prying up mollusks. Fishing here is a dance with the reef. One must know exactly when each channel is passable, which reef flat will yield clams on a given week, where the green sea turtles lay eggs above the high tide line each season. During certain months, turtle tracks crisscross the sand, and the islanders collect the eggs for food, leaving just enough for the next generation. At other times, wild honey is abundant in the forest, or fruits fall ripe from the canopy. Each season offers its gifts, and the Sentinelese calendar is attuned to them all. One can imagine, though never witness, the community moving inland to harvest honey from bees in tall trees, or gathering roots after a heavy rain when the ground is soft. Their economy is that of sufficiency, protein from the reef and lagoon, carbohydrates from forest plants and the occasional wild pig. They raise no livestock. Pigs on the island are descendants of animals that likely floated from elsewhere or were left by outsiders long ago. Notably, when Indian expeditions once offered a live piglet as a gift, the Sentinelese killed and buried it immediately, having no desire to domesticate the creature. A society that has thrived for centuries without farming has no need to corral pigs. Doing so would only tether them to one place. Mobility and flexibility are key. The islanders shift their temporary villages from time to time, likely following game or conserving local resources. Ash mounds seen from afar indicate spots where shellfish are roasted and eaten. Their calcium-rich remains returned to the sand. If you scan the beach carefully, you may even spot little footprints alongside larger ones, where children followed their parents at low tide in informal school in the art of foraging. All of this routine, fishing, foraging, child-rearing, goes on unobserved by outsiders. What little we know comes from rare glimpses and cautious inferences. No anthropologist has ever lived among the Sentinelese to take notes, no linguist has catalogued their verbs. The Sentinelese language remains unidentified. It might be distantly related to the Onge-Jarawa languages, or it might be a completely unique tongue. No word of it is recorded beyond the shouts exchanged at the shoreline. When neighboring tribes encountered the Sentinelese during friendly contact missions, even they could not understand the words. The Onge refer to North Sentinel Island as Kia Diekwokwe and the people there as Chankuate, but there is little more than that. Oral tradition of other Andaman tribes suggests that even in the deep past the Sentinelese kept to themselves. It is quite possible that the Sentinelese have the oldest continuous culture in the region, precisely because they avoided the catastrophes that befell others who welcomed strangers. Those catastrophes arrived for the other Andaman peoples mainly in the 19th and 20th centuries. North Sentinel's relative isolation spared its inhabitants the worst of it, but not entirely. For a long time, the outside world simply didn't bother with this island. The East India Company established a penal colony in the Andamans in 1858 after the Indian Rebellion, choosing Chatham Island, 11.67 degrees north, 92.76 degrees east, near Port Blair as the site for Kalapani, the infamous prison where Indian freedom fighters were exiled. That colonial outpost gradually spread over South Andaman, and British surveyors began charting every island in the vicinity. North Sentinel Island appeared as a little polygon on their maps, often annotated with warnings like, "Inhabited by hostile tribe, landing dangerous." One of the earliest recorded mentions came in 1771 when an East India Company survey vessel, the Diligent, passed by and noted lights on the shore, evidence of people, but no landing was attempted. The island was left alone for over a century after that, spared a visit even as neighbouring islands saw increasing colonial interference. The first significant intrusion into Sentinelese territory occurred in January 1880. The British colonial administration in Port Blair had grown curious, and incurably nosy, as one writer put it, about the natives of this inscrutable island. They dispatched an armed reconnaissance led by a young naval officer, Maurice Vidal Portman. Portman, barely 20 and styled with the title officer in charge of the Andamanese, had already made a name for himself, collecting natives from various tribes for study and sometimes for display. He was a man of his era, convinced that scientific curiosity justified almost anything. On the 29th of January, 1880, Portman landed on North Sentinel's beach with a large party, armed sailors, convict orderlies, and captured Onch guides from a neighbouring tribe. They found abandoned huts, neat pathways, and fresh footprints in the sand, but no people. The Sentinelese, likely seeing the intruders coming, had melted into the forest. Portman's team spent days searching the interior. On the 2nd of February, 1880, they finally encountered a few islanders, an elderly couple and some children. Instead of greeting them peacefully, Portman's party seized the 5 Sentinelese and brought them aboard their ship. The British claimed this was for humanitarian reasons, to enlighten and medically examine them, but the result was tragic. The elderly man and woman quickly fell ill in Port Blair, afflicted by illnesses to which they had no immunity. They died in a matter of days. The panicked British then rushed the 2 surviving children back to North Sentinel, depositing them on the beach along with some gifts, perhaps metal pots and handkerchiefs, in the hope of placating the tribe. One can only imagine the terror and grief of those children, suddenly orphaned and returned as the sole survivors of their kidnapping. It is believed that the first gift the modern world brought to North Sentinel was disease. In the wake of Portman's misadventure, the Sentinelese had a new and potent reason to loathe outsiders. Scholars today argue that this single event, the 1880 abduction, may be the root of the tribe's aggressive rejection of contact for the next 140 years. If so, who could blame them? Portman himself wasn't finished. He visited North Sentinel several more times during his tenure, often finding the island eerily empty. In 1883, he landed again but met no one. In 1885, he staged a bizarre photo shoot on the island, posing elaborately with some Andamanese people he had brought, trying to create an ethnographic tableau for the camera. Portman was an early practitioner of anthropological photography, albeit of a highly staged and exploitative kind. During one of these sojourns, he catalogued the islanders' possessions found in abandoned huts, fish spears, bows, adzes, and arrows tipped with bone and stone. He noted that the Sentinelese seemed to live in small, shifting bands rather than large villages, and he speculated erroneously that they might be a degenerate offshoot of the Onge. Portman never managed to speak with the Sentinelese or witness their daily life. After 1887, he left the Andamans, and the colonial authorities largely lost interest in the island. North Sentinel returned to its seclusion, but not without occasional unwelcome guests. The 13th of August, 1896, a convict escaped from the penal colony in Port Blair on a makeshift raft. This Indian prisoner, guilty of murder, drifted across 50 kilometers of open water and incredibly washed up alive on North Sentinel's reef. He probably thought he'd found a literal escape to paradise. Instead, he met a community that had no intention of hosting him. A search party from Port Blair found his body on the beach a few days later with a dozen arrow wounds and a slit throat. The corpse had been dragged inland and then returned to the shore, as if to say, "Take him back." The colonial report noted, with Victorian primness, that no Sentinelese were seen. It didn't need to add that their arrows had spoken clearly enough. The British authorities, chastened, did not pursue retaliation. To their credit, or perhaps due to resource constraints, they mostly left the tribe alone for the next half-century, content to label North Sentinel on maps as an unfriendly place and avoid it. Through the first half of the 20th century, North Sentinel Island lingered as a footnote in British gazettes, a place best left alone. Meanwhile, the rest of the Andaman Islands were being transformed. World War II rolled through. The Japanese invaded the Andamans in March 1942, ousting the British for 3 brutal years. Port Blair's cellular jail saw new atrocities under Japanese military police. In 1943, Indian nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose arrived under Japanese escort and dramatically hoisted the Indian tricolour in Port Blair, renaming the islands Shaheed and Swaraj as symbols of Indian independence. Of course, the British returned in 1945 after Japan's defeat, and then in 1947 India gained independence. Through all these convulsions of empire, the Sentinelese likely noticed nothing beyond perhaps a distant drone of aircraft or an unfamiliar ship's silhouette on the horizon. When the Union Jack was lowered and the Indian flag raised in Port Blair in 1947, the transaction meant nothing on North Sentinel's shores. The price of fish, as one historian quipped, remained the same. Independent India, inheriting the Andamans in 1947, could have easily repeated colonial mistakes, conquering or assimilating the tribes by force. Instead, after some debate, Indian authorities eventually developed a policy of minimal interference. At first, in the 1950s and 60s, there were clumsy attempts to reach out to various tribes, with an eye to their welfare, but also national integration. Some tribes like the Great Andamanese had already been decimated by disease and were living in resettlement camps near Port Blair by then, numbering only a few dozens. The Jarawa and Unj still roamed their forests and resisted outsider incursions, sometimes violently. North Sentinel's people, for their part, had kept all foreigners at arrow's length since Portman's time, and the Indian government had no immediate reason to bother them. For a while, North Sentinel was simply marked off limits and mostly forgotten again. That changed in the late 1960s, when anthropologists and local officials grew curious and a bit ambitious about making friendly contact. In 1967, a formal contact expedition was organized by the Anthropological Survey of India. A team led by anthropologist T.N. Pandit sailed to North Sentinel and anchored off the reef, determined to show the Sentinelese that not all outsiders were kidnappers or convicts. Pandit and his colleagues had already been working gently with the Jarawa and Unj tribes. Their strategy here was one of cautious generosity. They would leave gifts on the beach and back away, hoping to establish trust. On the 27th of March, 1970, Pandit's group made one of the first documented peaceful landings. They waded ashore on an empty beach and left behind coconuts, bananas, bits of iron, and even a live pig as offerings. In a somewhat absurd flourish of government ceremony, they also erected a stone tablet proclaiming the island part of the Republic of India, as if the Sentinelese, who cannot read English, needed reminding of who claimed to govern them. The team did not encounter any islanders face to face. The Sentinelese likely watched from the forest line, unseen. After a few hours, hearing nothing but bird calls, Pandit departed. When he returned months later, the tablet had vanished, perhaps tossed into the sea, and the gifts were gone. The pig's fate was later revealed by indirect evidence. The Sentinelese apparently speared the pig and buried it without eating it, a clear rejection of this unsolicited livestock. Nonetheless, these early trips were considered mild successes insofar as nobody was injured on either side. In 1970, for the outside world, curiosity intensified. A team from National Geographic obtained permission to make a documentary about the last Stone Age tribe, a phrase that media love, though it's misleading, and sailed to North Sentinel escorted by Indian officials. The project's grand title was Man in Search of Man. It could have been Man in Search of Trouble. The crew brought cameras and more gifts, the usual coconuts and bananas, plus a plastic doll and a live Yorkshire pig tied with rope. Their film would capture one of the few direct glimpses of the Sentinelese, though not in the way they hoped. As their motorboat chugged through an opening in the reef, several Sentinelese men emerged from the tree line, bows and arrows at the ready. The crew, to show goodwill, placed their bizarre collection of gifts on the sand and withdrew a short distance. The response was swift. An arrow came whistling out and struck the expedition's film director, Mr. Prem Vade, or one of the accompanying crew, in the thigh. This moment is frozen in a few blurry frames of film that later circulated widely, the shocked man pulling the long arrow from his leg while others scramble back to the boat. The Sentinelese warriors shouted in triumph a clear "Go away," in any language and then, interestingly, did not pursue further. They allowed the intruders to retreat. Before leaving in haste, the team managed to deposit their gifts on the beach. The Sentinelese then did something telling. They shot the pig full of arrows and buried its carcass in the sand, and they took the coconuts, which do not grow naturally on their island. The plastic doll was found later, discarded face down on the beach like a cursed object. The message was unmistakable: coconuts, useful food, or welcome, pigs and creepy dolls were not. And more importantly, do not presume you can film us. This incident did make it into the media. It perhaps cemented the Sentinelese global reputation for hostility. But to any thoughtful observer, the hostile party was not the islanders but the outsiders who tried to impose their narrative. If television had a conscience, as one commentator quipped, that arrow would have pinned it to the wall. In the wake of that fiasco, Indian authorities became more cautious but still persisted in their outreach attempts. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, T.N. Pandit and colleagues undertook numerous follow-up expeditions. They treated these trips almost like diplomatic calls, albeit one-sided. Typically, a team of a dozen officials and local guides would approach the reef on a dinghy, unarmed, often making noise by striking the side of the boat to announce their presence, so as not to startle the islanders. On one trip in 1981, as Pandit recorded in his diary, they saw huts inland with smoking fires, evidence people were present, but the Sentinelese chose not to confront the visitors that day. The team left coconuts and withdrew without meeting anyone. On another occasion, the 24th of October, 1981, Pandit's crew saw about a dozen Sentinelese on the shore. This time, no one shot arrows, but the islanders watched warily and did not approach, allowing the team to drop off their coconut offerings peaceably. These encounters were delicate affairs. Sometimes the Sentinelese men would gesture or even dance in a way that Pandit interpreted as signaling, "Enough for today, go back." The visitors always obeyed, retreating at the slightest sign of tension. Patience was key. One of the more dramatic incidents came in November 1982. A large contact party went to Constance Island, 11.52 degrees north, 92.27 degrees east, a small islet off the southwest tip of North Sentinel's Reef, accompanied by the local police superintendent, P.V. Sinari. As they approached, a group of Sentinelese appeared and launched a volley of arrows. Superintendent Sinari was struck by an arrow, though fortunately not mortally, likely a warning shot that found its mark. The officials quickly backed off, but notably the Sentinelese did not attempt to kill the downed man or anyone else. They simply defended their turf and then permitted the outsiders to retreat and even to leave gifts on the sand once they were a safe distance away. It was as if to say, "We will punish your intrusion, but if you behave, we won't pursue vengeance." Sinari recovered, and the Indian administration absorbed the lesson that even a friendly approach could trigger a swift hostile response if misjudged. The 1980s continued with this careful dance. In 1985, an expedition led by anthropologist J.K. Sarkar reported a relatively calm exchange. About 24 Sentinelese were seen, and though they were agitated, shouting and waving weapons, they did not shoot arrows. The team managed to unload 400 coconuts and 15 kilograms of sweet potatoes on the beach as gifts. The Sentinelese watched but made no attempt to attack, accepting the food once the visitors left. Later that same year, in December 1985, another group including M.K. Raha and even the Lieutenant Governor of the islands, T.S. Oberoi, went along on a contact trip, a sign of how high-profile this anthropological mission had become. They observed 26 Sentinelese, 13 men, 9 women, 4 children, with 2 women visibly pregnant, details carefully noted. The islanders displayed some defensive hostility but refrained from outright attack. The visitors again left hundreds of coconuts and withdrew. It was during this period that the officials realized the Sentinelese particularly valued coconuts, which are not naturally plentiful on their island. The few coconut palms they have likely drifted from elsewhere. The Sentinelese began to associate these strange visits with a bounty of easy food. A breakthrough of sorts came in early 1991. By this time, Madhumila Chattopadhyay, a young Indian anthropologist, and notably the first woman to participate in these expeditions, had joined the team. On the 4th of January, 1991, during one of the customary gift-dropping missions, something unexpected happened. A few Sentinelese actually approached the dinghy unarmed. A Sentinelese man waded into the water up to his chest, signaled for coconuts, and Madhumila and others began gently tossing coconuts toward him. More islanders, men, and even some women gathered on the beach, laughing excitedly as they picked up the floating coconuts. One man mimed placing a coconut on his head in a gesture of thanks or joy. In an extraordinary moment caught in a photograph, a Sentinelese woman is seen smiling broadly as she retrieves a coconut from the shallows, while a man ties one of the offered cloth gifts, a white headband, around his forehead ceremonially. This was perhaps the closest to a friendly contact ever achieved. No common language was exchanged beyond smiles and gestures, but the interaction lasted a few happy minutes. Madhumila later recounted that when they finally had to depart, daylight fading and safety in mind, the Sentinelese made no attempt to detain them or harm them. It was as if decades of patient outreach had finally earned a few minutes of trust. However, the Indian authorities had a difficult judgment call. Should they press further now that the door was cracked open, or was this fragile rapport a sign that it was time to stop? The decision, in a rare show of bureaucratic wisdom, was to end the contact expeditions. In 1996, the administration of Andaman and Nicobar declared a new policy: hands off, eyes on. The visits bearing gifts were discontinued. It was concluded that the risk of causing disease or encouraging dangerous encounters outweighed the benefit of brief contacts. The government would henceforth protect the Sentinelese' isolation rather than attempt to breach it. Anthropologists, including Pandit, ultimately supported this move. After all, by 1991 they had gathered enough observational data, they knew the tribe's approximate population, they had seen some of their activities from a distance, and crucially, they had shown the islanders that not all outsiders come with guns. That was enough. To push further would be to satisfy curiosity at the expense of the islanders' autonomy. And so, apart from occasional checking from afar, North Sentinel was essentially closed to the world not by the islanders doing alone, but by official decree. This "leave them alone" stance was soon vindicated by events. Nature, it turned out, had its own test in store of whether the Sentinelese could survive unassisted and whether outsiders could resist intervening. On the morning of the 26th of December, 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami, one of the worst natural disasters in recorded history, roared across the Bay of Bengal. A massive undersea earthquake near Sumatra sent waves radiating in all directions. The Andaman and Nicobar archipelago was hit hard, low-lying areas in South Andaman and Nicobar were inundated, and thousands of people were killed across India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Thailand. Given North Sentinel's small size and modest elevation, many feared that the tribe could have been wiped out entirely. In the disaster's aftermath, the Indian Coast Guard dispatched reconnaissance helicopters to survey remote islands for survivors. When a chopper flew low over North Sentinel Island, on the 28th of December, 2004, they saw that the earthquake had tilted portions of the reef upward and carved new channels through the lagoon. Coastal forests were flattened in places. As the helicopter circled, a lone Sentinelese man emerged onto the beach, standing amidst the debris of the storm, and defiantly shot an arrow at the hovering aircraft. The pilot wisely veered off. But he returned with a report that warmed many hearts. The fact that an islander had the strength and will to shoot at them was proof that the Sentinelese had survived. They needed no rescue, in fact, they clearly didn't want one. Somehow, whether by luck or ancient knowledge, they had weathered the tsunami. It was later presumed that they sensed the approaching disaster, perhaps the animal's strange behavior or the sudden receding of the ocean, a classic tsunami precursor, alerted them and moved to higher ground. When the sea receded that day, they might have even run out to gather stranded fish, then run back as the second wave chased them. Such legends are common in coastal cultures. In any case, their immediate response to the helicopter was effectively, "We're fine, go away." A disaster for the rest of us had become, in a way, their affirmation of independence. The modern world, alas, has a habit of intruding even after being warned. In 2006, two outsiders met a fate similar to the 1896 convict, though under far less sympathetic circumstances. On the 27th of January, 2006, a small boat carrying two fishermen, Sundaraj and Pandit Tiwari, drifted from its anchor while the men were asleep. They had been illegally harvesting mud crabs in prohibited waters. By dawn, the boat had come ashore on North Sentinel's reef. The unfortunate men were soon spotted by Sentinelese hunters, who, true to form, attacked. The fishermen were killed, likely swiftly, with arrows, and their bodies dragged inland. When an Indian Coast Guard helicopter arrived to retrieve the remains, it faced a volley of arrows and had to abort. Through the foliage, the pilots glimpsed that the fishermen had been buried in shallow graves by the Sentinelese. Indian officials made no further attempt to recover the corpses, fearing more conflict. The logic was simple: to retrieve the dead, they would have to risk more lives, both the islanders and their own personnel. Better to let those men's bodies return to the earth on the island. The families of the fishermen were paid compensation by the government, and a warning was broadcast to all local seafarers that the 5 kilometers exclusion zone around North Sentinel must be respected, drunk or sober. Indeed, one of the two victims had been intoxicated that night, a fatal mistake in these waters. This incident reinforced how vital the enforced isolation is, not just for the tribe's safety but for outsiders' safety as well. One confrontation in 2006 did more to deter poachers and thrill-seekers than any number of government circulars could. Yet even that grisly lesson was not enough for some. The most infamous trespass on North Sentinel happened in November 2018, and it brought the world's attention and outrage squarely onto this tiny island. John Allen Chau, a 26-year-old American from Washington state, was a self-styled missionary and adventurer who became obsessed with converting the Sentinelese to Christianity. He was well aware of the island's off-limits status. In fact, he had visited the Andamans twice before to scope out the situation. In his diary, later recovered, he described the Sentinelese as Satan's last stronghold and felt divinely called to bring them the gospel. Chau was nothing if not determined. He bribed local fishermen with $325, about 25,000 Indian rupees, to smuggle him near North Sentinel, evading the Indian Coast Guard patrols. On the 15th of November, 2018, under cover of pre-dawn darkness, the fisherman towed Chau in a kayak to within a few kilometers of the island and let him paddle the rest of the way. He carried a waterproof Bible, some gifts like fish and a toy, and loudly sang worship songs as he approached the shore, an oddly cheerful overture to people known to reject strangers. The Sentinelese met him on the beach. Chau attempted to speak to them in English and share the love of Jesus, as he wrote later. Their response, an arrow, fired from a distance, which lodged in the Bible he held in front of his chest. Panicking, Chau swam back to the fisherman's boat, which had stayed nearby, and spent the night offshore. By this point, the sensible course would have been to abandon the mission. But Chau was resolute. On the 16th of November, he returned to the island. That was the last time he was seen alive. The fisherman later reported seeing the Sentinelese dragging what appeared to be Chau's body along the beach the following day, and burying it in the sand. When news of the killing reached the authorities, it set off an international media storm. Some Christian evangelicals hailed Chau as a martyr, many others condemned his foolishness and arrogance. Anthropologists and indigenous rights activists were unanimously relieved that the Indian government stood by its non-interference policy. In line with that, no attempt was made to recover Chau's remains. The police did arrest the 7 fishermen who had helped him, charging them under colonial-era laws for facilitating illegal entry to a tribal reserve, but Chau himself effectively died beyond the reach of any court or rescue. His diary. Entries revealed he knew he might be killed and accepted that risk. His final note even asks forgiveness for the islanders, if they shoot me. The episode was tragic, but it served to reassert why exactly North Sentinel must remain forbidden. A young man's misguided quest had nearly unleashed a lethal pathogen on an uncontacted tribe. Only his own death prevented that scenario. The world was reminded that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, for the good of all. As one Indian official said dryly, "We have no case of murder. If there is an offense, it is on his side for trespassing." There would be no prosecution of the Sentinelese, of course. How could there be? To charge them under Indian law would require entering their island with force and hauling someone to court, a manifestly absurd and immoral proposition. Instead, India let the matter rest. John Chau remains buried somewhere on North Sentinel to this day, a macabre testament to the islanders' unwavering message, "Do not disturb." In the aftermath of Chau's killing, the Indian government quietly tightened restrictions even further. There was a brief confusion when, in mid-2018, India announced a relaxation of certain travel rules, the restricted area permit system, for the Andamans to boost tourism, and North Sentinel Island's name mistakenly appeared on a list of islands open to visitors. This was quickly corrected. An embarrassed bureaucrat in Delhi issued a clarification that no, North Sentinel is definitely not open. By early 2019, the policy of non-interference was explicitly reaffirmed in Parliament, as we saw. India even signalled internationally that it considers the Sentinelese a sovereign people in all but name. The United Nations had adopted a declaration on indigenous peoples in 2007 affirming the right of such peoples to remain uncontacted, and while India's engagement with UN mechanisms is cautious, in practice India has given the Sentinelese exactly that right. The island is sometimes humorously called the Republic of North Sentinel in Port Blair's administrative circles, with the understanding that its foreign policy is enforced by bow and arrow. Indeed, more than one Indian commentator noted that Chau's death was the result of his illegal invasion of their territory, not the other way around. So here we are, an island, a people, and an arrangement of mutual avoidance that has held for decades. It is tempting to romanticize the Sentinelese as living in the Stone Age, or as a pristine example of humanity untouched by modernity. That would be a mistake. They are not living fossils or noble savages, they are a dynamic society making active choices about their engagements. In fact, they are very much a part of modern history. They've just chosen a unique strategy for dealing with it: extreme selective isolation. Consider, for instance, that metal arrowhead lodged in Chow's Bible. The Sentinelese did not smelt iron, but they are no strangers to metal. Over the years, many pieces of flotsam have washed onto their shores, and they have ingeniously repurposed them. The most famous cache of metal arrived in August 1981, when the MV Primrose, a 16,000-ton cargo ship sailing from Bangladesh to Australia, ran aground on North Sentinel's reef during a storm. The crew radioed for help, reporting that islanders were gathering on the beach with spears, and that they feared a hostile boarding. It took nearly a week for rescue helicopters to arrive due to rough weather. During that time, the sailors watched the Sentinelese men assembling rafts, trying to reach the stranded ship. Luckily for all, high seas kept the islanders from reaching the Primrose, and the crew was airlifted out without direct conflict. But the ship, carrying supplies ranging from food to tools, remained stuck on the reef, slowly breaking apart. Over subsequent months and years, the Sentinelese salvaged whatever they could. To this day, observers have noted Sentinelese arrows with metal tips and blades that appear to be crafted from salvaged iron. When anthropologists glimpsed a Sentinelese man's belt in 1991 holding a metal dagger, they surmised it was pounded from the Primrose's steel plating. The Primrose's skeletal hull eventually slipped off the reef and sank, but it had delivered a trove of material that the islanders skillfully incorporated into their toolkit. This fact demolishes the idea that they are Stone Age people frozen in time. They adopt useful modern materials when chance provides them, they just don't care for the company or counsel of those who bring them. As one writer elegantly put it, for the Sentinelese, outsiders' technology is just geology with a story. You can keep the story, we'll keep the metal. Other traces of the outside world have also found their way to North Sentinel. Driftwood from distant lands washes up, sometimes with alien writing on it. Glass bottles, likely thrown off ships, occasionally litter the beaches. The islanders use shards of glass for cutting or sharpening, one assumes. And from time to time, illegal fishing boats operate on the fringes of the exclusion zone at night, hoping to poach rich sea cucumber beds or turtles. The Indian Coast Guard does its best to intercept these trespassers. There have been multiple seizures of Thai and Myanmarese fishing boats poaching in the Andamans over the years. Still, the temptation of the Bay of Bengal's marine wealth means some try their luck. In response, Indian patrol vessels quietly keep station near North Sentinel, using radar and occasionally aerial drones to spot intruders. New technologies are emerging. The government can deploy satellite imagery and AI algorithms to detect rogue boats without having a physical presence on the island. Conservation NGOs advocate this eyes-on, hands-off monitoring as a way to protect the Sentinelese from afar. The risk, of course, is that the same surveillance used to guard could someday be misused to pry. Imagine a scenario where someone proposes to film the Sentinelese secretly with high-resolution drones. For research, it would be a high-tech breach of their privacy. So far, India has resisted such temptations, largely treating the islanders with the dignity of absence. There are occasional aerial surveys. The policy allows a circumnavigation now and then by officials to ensure the tribe seems healthy. These typically involve a boat or plane making a distant loop and confirming that the usual signs of life, smoke from cooking fires, canoes, perhaps people on the beach, are present. No close approaches, no landings. The idea is to verify from a distance that all is well, without the islanders ever needing to know they were observed. Culturally, what little we know of the Sentinelese comes from those rare interactions and analogies to their neighbors. The Sentinelese men carry long bows, perhaps 1.5 to 2 m tall, made of seasoned wood, with arrows that can reach well over 1 m in length. These arrows have different tips depending on target: broad, barbed points for hunting fish in the shallows, or puncturing unwanted visitors, and simpler pointed shafts for shooting birds or signaling across distances. They have been seen to use bark strips or plant fiber to string their bows. In the 1990s, during the amicable gift exchanges, the men sometimes approached with arrows narked but pointed downwards, a gesture of readiness but not firing. The women were observed staying slightly back, often chatting among themselves, occasionally laughing at the antics of the men in the water. In one instance, a Sentinelese woman's laughter was recorded when a man in Pandit's party miscommunicated a gesture. The women do not wear tops but often a kind of fiber skirt or leaves at the waist. The men wear belts or bands, sometimes with tiny daggers or tools attached. Both sexes adorn themselves, possibly with necklaces or headbands, and there were reports of body paint or clay being used, as is common in Andaman tribes for ritual or cosmetic purposes. One intriguing cultural detail: in 1991, A Sentinelese man gently placed a leaf or some greenery around the forehead of an Indian official who had waded in with coconuts, a possible sign of acknowledgement or even a ceremonial welcome, or perhaps a subtle way to say, "You may leave these and go." It's hard to interpret a culture from a few minutes of contact, but such moments tantalize the anthropologist's mind. We know they make fire. During monsoon rains, smoke has been observed rising from within the forest, indicating they have mastered fire maintenance. There was speculation in Victorian times that some Andaman tribes didn't know how to kindle fire and kept embers burning perpetually. However, it's unconfirmed if the Sentinelese generate fire or conserve it from lightning strikes. They likely have huts inland for the monsoon season and windbreaks on the beach for fair weather. They build small outriggerless canoes that they maneuver only in the lagoon and reef, not venturing beyond into the open sea. This suggests that, unlike some Pacific islanders, they are not deep-sea navigators. Their world is the reef circle and the island within. Interestingly, coconuts are a luxury to them. The word spread that they greatly desired the coconuts given by visitors, cracking them open eagerly to drink the sweet water inside. Because coconut palms are present but not prolific on the island, every drifting nut that germinates on the beach is like a gift from the sea. In one recorded instance, Sentinelese individuals climbed trees to knock down coconuts after a storm had deposited some on the island, showing they recognized their value. This is a reminder that even in their isolation, the Sentinelese environment is not entirely static. New plant species can wash ashore, climate and sea currents alter the drift of nourishing flotsam, and the Sentinelese adapt. Legally and philosophically, North Sentinel Island occupies a unique space. It is Indian territory on paper, part of India's Andaman and Nicobar Union Territory, yet the Indian state accepts that it exercises zero direct control there. In effect, the islanders are self-governing. India's role is reduced to an invisible protective ring around their world. The situation raises profound questions about sovereignty and the rights of indigenous people. If a people desire no contact, do modern nations have an obligation to enforce that desire? India has answered yes. The relevant law, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Protection of Aboriginal Tribes, Regulation, 1956, and its later amendments, not only forbid unauthorized entry but also prohibit photographing or attempting to interact with the tribes. In a 2019 clarification, the government emphasized that the Sentinelese are to be left entirely alone and any approach closer than 5 kilometers is illegal. Moreover, multiple overlapping laws buttress this isolation: the Foreigners Act and passport rules, to keep out curious foreigners like Chow, the Indian Forest Act and Wildlife Protection Act, which treat the tribal habitat as a sanctuary, and even the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes, Prevention of Atrocities Act, 1989, which, while designed to protect disadvantaged tribes from harassment, theoretically could apply if someone tried to harm the Sentinelese. India's posture is thus that of a guardian at the gate, rather than a ruler of the island. This is a remarkable inversion of the typical colonial mindset. Here, the powerful modern state voluntarily restrains itself, practicing what one might call consensual geography, the idea that a map's lines mean little unless those who live there agree to them. The 5 km buffer acts as a de facto international border in all but name. Coast Guard vessels that patrol make gentle announcements over loudspeakers if any fishing boat strays too close, effectively saying, "You are now leaving India, turn back for your own safety." One might wonder, what about emergencies or humanitarian concerns? What if a disease outbreak or a cyclone devastates the tribe? This scenario has been contemplated. The official protocol is to intervene only if absolutely necessary to save lives, and even then, to do so with minimal physical contact. For instance, after the 2004 tsunami, had the reconnaissance shown the tribe in peril or starving, India was prepared to airdrop food and medicine on the beach, then withdraw. But importantly, they would not force themselves on the islanders. The help would be offered in a way that allowed the Sentinelese to accept or ignore it as they saw fit. In effect, the Sentinelese have veto power over any aid. Critics might ask, is it ethical to let people suffer or die in isolation if modern help could save them? The counter-argument, supported by anthropologists, is that the introduction of outside aid or medicine could be even more catastrophic due to disease transmission and cultural collapse. The Jarawa and Onge experience offers cautionary tales. Once peaceful contact was established with those tribes in the 1990s, their populations suffered measles outbreaks and a breakdown of traditional life, requiring continuous government management to avoid exploitation by outsiders. The Sentinelese have been spared that fate so far. Another dimension of North Sentinel's story is geopolitical. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands sit in a strategic location in the eastern Indian Ocean, near the mouth of the Malacca Strait, a choke point through which roughly 25% of global trade passes. Recognizing this, India established its first and only Tri-Services Command, Army, Navy, Air Force combined, in Port Blair in 2001, aiming to project power and keep an eye on major sea lanes. India has been investing heavily in the island's infrastructure, new ports, airstrips, and even plans for a transshipment megaport on Great Nicobar Island, 6.97 degrees north, 93.88 degrees east, with 100 billion Indian rupees, $1.36 billion US dollars, earmarked for development. The government touts these as part of the Act East policy, strengthening ties with Southeast Asia and countering Chinese influence in the region. Tourism is also booming. Before the pandemic, 500,000 tourists, 505,000 in 2019, visited the Andamans annually, diving in coral reefs, honeymooning on Havelock Island, and so forth. Plans are afoot to build luxury resorts and even a yacht marina in some islands. In all this hustle, North Sentinel stands out as an anomaly. It offers no harbour, no resources, aside from fish and timber needed by its inhabitants, and it cannot be developed or visited without global outcry. Strategically, though, it does hold a certain value. It signals India's commitment to safeguarding indigenous peoples, which bolsters India's moral standing. And practically, the exclusion zone doubles as a marine protected area, where fish stocks can replenish safe from commercial exploitation. Coast Guard officers sometimes joke that the Sentinelese unwittingly enforce fisheries law by their mere presence. Poachers know that if the patrols don't catch them, the islanders might. There is also a subtle diplomatic benefit. In international forums, India can point to North Sentinel as proof that it nurtures diversity and human rights in a broad sense. At a time when uncontacted tribes in the Amazon are threatened by logging and mining, India's hands-off stewardship of the Sentinelese is often praised. Survival International, a global indigenous rights group, lauded India after 2018 for standing firm on isolating the islanders and prosecuting those who tried to breach that isolation. It's an interesting reversal. What was once considered a policy of benign neglect is now heralded as enlightened. And India, rather than bristle at foreign commentary on its internal matter, embraced the support, recognizing that virtually everyone, bar a fringe of zealots, agrees the Sentinelese should be left alone. What do we make of the Sentinelese in a broader human context? They force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our civilization. One is that contact is not inherently benign. We in the modern world often assume sharing our advantages, medicine, technology, religion, governance, is a gift. But from the viewpoint of societies like the Sentinelese, those gifts historically come wrapped in catastrophe. Every arrow they shoot is an epidemiological warning: keep your germs away, we remember what happened last time. And indeed, history shows that remote peoples who encountered outsiders often suffered a population collapse of 50 to 90% due to disease within a few years, a fate that befell many Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, and yes, other Andaman tribes like the Great Andamanese, who went from thousands to a few dozen within a century. The Sentinelese somehow ducked that fate, likely by fierce geographic quarantine. This suggests an astonishing historical savvy. They might not articulate germ theory, but they observed cause and effect. After strangers come, people die. So they made a collective decision ages ago that the best foreign policy was a sharp volley of arrows. It worked. Other tribes in the Andamans that were more welcoming, the Great Andamanese, for example, who initially befriended the British, were ravaged by influenza, measles, and alcoholism, reduced to pitiable remnants by the 20th century. The Jarawa, who held out with hostility until the 1990s, maintained relatively better health and culture until recently, though even they have begun to struggle as contact increased. The Sentinelese took it one step further: absolute refusal. And in doing so, they may be the only community from the age of exploration to emerge into the 21st century virtually unscathed and unchanged. In a world where indigenous groups everywhere were defeated by guns or germs or assimilation, the Sentinelese are a singular case of not this time. Their success, however, is fragile. They survived tsunamis and quakes by being adaptable, moving camps, listening to the environment. But the 21st century threats are different. Climate change is one. As sea levels creep up, North Sentinel's coral reef, which has already been stressed by warming, evidenced by bleached white corals in recent satellite images, could lose vitality. The reef is not just a food source, it's the island's wave break. If it erodes, storms will hit the shoreline harder. The monsoons have become more erratic too. Satellite data suggests tropical cyclones in the Bay of Bengal are intensifying. A cyclone that would flood a city with its storm surge could wash over a low L like North Sentinel with dreadful effect. The islanders likely have cyclone shelters, perhaps pockets in higher ground or sturdy old trees they tie themselves to. Some Andaman tribes did that in past cyclones. But there's a worry. What if a supercyclone essentially bulldozes the island? In such an event, doing nothing might mean letting an entire people perish. Doing something, like sending a relief team, would violate their core principle and might spark violence or disease anyway. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. Indian authorities have quietly considered contingency plans, such as dropping emergency supplies from helicopters after a megastorm and then monitoring from afar if the Sentinelese utilize them, e.g. leaving sealed food and water that they could choose to take. But ultimately, they lean towards letting the Sentinelese guide their own fate even in catastrophe. A senior official once analogized, if a hurricane hit an American uncontacted tribe, would the US Army storming guns blazing to save them? Of course not, they'd try to help carefully or mourn if too late. The analogy may falter because no tribe in the US is truly uncontacted, but the sentiment is clear: nature might eventually succeed where colonials failed, but we will not interfere unless absolutely forced. Another looming threat is less dramatic but relentless: plastic pollution. The Andaman Sea gets its share of floating garbage. We already noted bottles wash up. More insidiously, small plastic bits and toxic flotsam can enter the food chain. The Sentinelese diet of seafood could expose them to microplastics or mercury from global industrial runoff, the modern world's gifts arriving without a handshake. These are slow threats, not as obvious as a boatload of trespassers. And there's little to be done. You can't build a filter around an island. One hopes that the relative remoteness of the Bay of Bengal, far from the biggest garbage patches, affords them some shield. Yet, not all future scenarios are grim. It is also possible that the Sentinelese continue much as they have, adapting in place, for generations to come. If sea level rise nibbles at their coast, they might relocate inland bit by bit. If fish stocks change, they'll shift diet to more forest produce or vice versa. They might adopt or discard new practices as needed, much as they adopted metal, or new plants that naturalize on the island. Human cultures are not static unless dead. The Sentinelese could evolve in their own way without ever opening up to us. There's a wonderful possibility that a century from now, they'll still be there, having outlasted perhaps even the nation of India or the concept of passports and visas. Imagine, in 2125, North Sentinel might remain as it is, an autonomous little world, while around it AI-driven ships ply the seas and satellites beam data across continents. It would be a triumph of persistence, a small society proving that there is no single inevitable path for humans, that one can opt out of the global web and still live well. Indeed, from a certain perspective, the Sentinelese are supremely modern. They made a choice about globalization long before the term existed. They chose privacy and self-determination over integration. In doing so, they've forced the rest of us to confront what we value more, our curiosity or their agency. So far, agency is winning, albeit backed by the might of the Indian state enforcing it for them. Their existence also poses an ethical mirror. We broadcast messages to hypothetical extraterrestrials and debate how to behave if we meet aliens, yet here is a truly alien culture, to us, on our own planet, and the consensus is to not impose ourselves on them. It's a measure of moral progress that today's default approach is protection, not conquest. Can we extend that lesson further? There are other uncontacted tribes, especially in the Amazon. Brazil and Peru host about 70 to 100 such groups. Some of those are under threat from illegal loggers and miners. The Sentinelese case strengthens the argument that strict no-go zones are essential and can work to preserve such peoples. India's success in preventing outsiders from reaching North Sentinel since the late 1990s stands in contrast to, say, the Brazilian difficulties in patrolling the vast Amazon. Of course, North Sentinel is tiny and surrounded by water, easier to guard. But still, it offers a model of political will aligning with indigenous rights. Back on the island's shores, life likely continues in its age-old rhythm. At night, the skies are brilliant with stars, no light pollution here. The Sentinelese probably have stories about the lights in the sky, or at least a familiarity that the lights are constant and harmless. Do they notice the occasional moving satellite or the International Space Station gliding across the heavens? Perhaps it would be the only sign that the firmament has other actors. To them, it might just be another transient spark like a bright planet. Their concerns are more immediate. Is the turtle season good this year? Did the last storm fell any big trees that need clearing? Has a new generation of children learned how to swim in the lagoon and climb for honey? Those are the news headlines on North Sentinel. We, as outsiders, can only speculate responsibly, always tethering our imaginings to known facts. We know, for example, that the Sentinelese build small fires inside their huts, seen by the smoke vents. We know they use some form of canoe outriggers, witnessed from afar. We know they likely have a kinship system and leadership structure like other Andaman tribes, possibly elders or headmen guiding decisions, but we have no names or details. They have presumably rituals or beliefs about the world beyond. Perhaps they think the rest of the world is not populated by humans at all, given how strangely we behave when glimpsed. Or maybe they have an oral history of a great sickness long ago, from Portman's kidnapping, and thus taboo any contact with outsiders. When the Onge tribe first encountered British officials in the 19th century, they believed the pale-skinned newcomers were spirits of the dead due to their complexion. Did the Sentinelese think the same of Portman and his men? Or did they simply not care what they were, as long as they stayed away? So many questions that will likely remain unanswered, and perhaps that's for the best. One could argue North Sentinel Island is also a kind of natural experiment. It's one of the few places on Earth where an ecosystem and a human culture have been relatively undisturbed by industrial civilization for centuries. The reef around the island is likely one of the healthiest in the region, given no trawling or dynamite fishing ever happens there. The forest is intact, not a single tree felled for timber exports. The ocean around is a de facto marine reserve. Indeed, scientists have mused that North Sentinel's reefs might serve as a baseline for climate change impact on coral, given minimal local stresses. There's poetic justice in that. The Sentinelese inadvertently protect a bubble of biodiversity simply by existing and defending their home. They are stewards by resistance. Environmentalists sometimes cite their story when arguing for indigenous protected areas. The idea that empowering native people to manage their land often results in better conservation than external management. North Sentinel is the ultimate proof. No conservation officers needed, just a determined community and the absence of meddling, and nature flourishes. It's instructive, too, to consider North Sentinel Island on a map of the Andamans. The administrative map shows North Sentinel as a tiny speck in South Andaman District, under the jurisdiction of some remote office. But in reality, the island is like a sovereign microstate inside India. One anthropologist half-jokingly called it the Stone Age Vatican, small, insular, surrounded by walls of theology, or in this case, arrows, that the outside world respects. The metaphor limps, but there is a sense that North Sentinel teaches us a kind of humility that borders on reverence. Not that the Sentinelese are saints or avatars of purity, they are human, with all the attendant follies and foibles any humans have, but that their very insistence on not being a part of us is something to honor. In a world obsessed with connectivity, they practice the sublime art of disconnection. Every few years, a sensational headline pops up: Mystery Tribe may hold clues to human origins, or Island of the Lost Tribe untouched by time. These invariably refer to the Sentinelese. And every time, those who know the facts push back. The Sentinelese are not living fossils, not a key to some anthropological Eden. They are a living, changing society firmly in the present, their present, which is what matters to them. They probably laugh, love, grieve, and argue much like any humans. They have likely known hardship, infant mortality, cyclones, maybe food scarcity in tough seasons, and they have ways to endure and overcome. They have likely also known contentment, a successful turtle hunt, a full moon dance, the birth of a healthy child. None of that needs our validation or documentation to be real. One cannot help but imagine scenes from their daily life. Perhaps at dusk, a group of women sit around a fire roasting reef fish in yam-like tubers, gossiping about a misadventure someone had with a cranky wild boar. Nearby, children chase each other with miniature bows, playing hunter and prey games. Men return from the lagoon with a canoe laden with fish, and there is joy because tonight's dinner will be abundant. The forest behind them hums with nocturnal insects as the equatorial night sets in. Overhead, the Milky Way arches. They have no word for it that we know, but perhaps they call it the path of ancestors or something equally fitting. In such a moment, one realizes that their world is complete without us. Our world, however, would be poorer without theirs, not materially, but in the sense of human possibility. The Sentinelese offer a living counter-argument to the idea that there is only one path of progress. They are, in a sense, free in a way few of us modern people can grasp, free from the nation-state, free from the market economy, free from the constant surveillance and documentation of life. Their freedom is perilous. A bad disease or a climate shock could wipe them out, but so is any freedom. They accept the trade-offs we are unwilling to accept, and they have carried on. What does the future hold? Indian officials quietly say that the best-case scenario is that nothing changes. They hope that in 50 years, the Sentinelese population will still be viable, perhaps even grown a bit if left in peace, and still isolated. That would count as a huge success, an indigenous people surviving intact well into the 21st and 22nd century. To support that, India plans to keep the exclusion zone permanent, continue patrols, and avoid any temptations of exploitation. The Island Development Authority that is gung-ho about hotels on other islands has explicitly left North Sentinel off any development list. The cost of this policy is negligible, a few Coast Guard ship days and helicopter sorties per year. The benefit is incalculable in terms of human heritage preserved. But contingency plans exist for worst-case scenarios too. One internal report considered what to do if an epidemic, say, measles or COVID-19, somehow broke out among the Sentinelese, perhaps via an illegal visitor. The consensus was grim: by the time outsiders noticed such sickness, it might be too late to administer aid, and any intervention might just compound the tragedy. Unlike contacted tribes, the Sentinelese have no immunity bank built up. Even vaccines can be dangerous if given without proper cold chains and multiple doses. So the plan in such a dire event might be to let the disease run its course and then see if any survivors remain, a painful conclusion, but realistic. Similarly, if rising seas over decades visibly shrink the island and threaten their resource base, India might consider setting aside another uninhabited island nearby as a possible refuge. South Sentinel Island, just 50 kilometers south, is uninhabited but much smaller. However, relocating a tribe that doesn't even know the outside world exists would be essentially an invasion in itself. So these are academic musings. No one has a good answer for these hard questions. In broader imagination, the Sentinelese have almost become mythic symbols of ferocious independence. Some commentators half-seriously suggest that global diplomacy could learn from them. For example, what if every community had the right to declare a 5 kilometers no-go zone around what it holds dear? Some have dubbed this the Sentinelese principle. It's a provocative idea, villages or tribes worldwide saying, this patch is ours, outsiders keep out unless invited. Of course, in a planet of overlapping claims, it's unworkable at large scales. But the concept is a healthy antidote to the prevailing notion that everything and everyone must be accessible. The Sentinelese remind us that, no, can be a complete sentence. One can't help but indulge in a bit of what-if fantasy. What if the Sentinelese ran the world for a week? Likely, they'd impose a radical slowdown. No uninvited visits, diplomacy only by mutual consent. Economies would have to revolve around local resources. Imagine telling New York City it can only eat what grows within 5 kilometers. Success might be measured by days undisturbed rather than constant growth. It wouldn't work for us on a global scale, we're far too entangled, but the thought experiment yields insights. In a time when we valorize ceaseless connectivity, the Sentinelese embody the virtue of silence and separation. It is perhaps the ultimate ethical boundary. They do not seek to change us, and we finally agree not to change them. The sun now sinks low over the Bay of Bengal, casting a golden pathway across the water toward North Sentinel Island. If you were again on that boat we started from, bobbing gently just outside the reef at twilight, you would see the island's silhouette dark against the fiery sky. You might hear the distant sound of surf breaking on coral, the island's nightly perimeter alarm, doing its endless job. You would see frigate birds gliding like black cutouts overhead as they return to roost. Perhaps, if you are very lucky, or unlucky, depending on viewpoint, you might spot a lone figure moving on the beach, checking a canoe or tending to a fire before nightfall. He does not wave at you, he likely doesn't even look in your direction, because you are too far to be of concern. To him, you're just another speck on the horizon that will be gone by morning. And indeed, as the dusk deepens, your captain turns the boat around to head back to Port Blair. The island disappears into the growing darkness, remaining what it has always been, an unsolved equation, a story that writes itself without readers. Not many places in the world can say that. North Sentinel Island stands almost alone in insisting on its own terms for existence. No empire subdued it, no religion claimed it, no merchant commodified it. Its people owe us nothing, not even their name. And in that lies a powerful lesson that challenges a fundamental assumption of our age, that everything and everyone must eventually integrate into one global system. The Sentinelese quietly rebut that claim by simply living each day as they did the day before, caretakers of a tiny universe. They wake with the sun, launch their canoes on the lagoon when the tide is right, harvest what they need, share it among themselves under the starlight, and sleep to the sound of the encircling sea. They neither know nor care that around them swells a planet frantic with change. In their steadfast way, they tell us that modernity is optional, that a small community can be happier courting the tides than conquering them. When morning comes again to the Andamans, the line of white surf on North Sentinel's reef will be drawn fresh, as it is every day, a natural boundary line as clear as any on a map. That surf line says what it has said for as long as anyone can recall: stay out. We're doing fine. The world has finally decided to listen. And so North Sentinel Island remains, in its inscrutable glory, carrying on into the 21st century and beyond, proof that sometimes the most enlightened thing the rest of us can do is nothing at all. Welcome to the island that does not want to be discovered. Let it remain so.